Welcome, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. Today, our speakers will focus on the areas of business, religion, and economics with regards to the pandemic. The panel will be chaired by Professor Durham, founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School. You should see a poll right now on your screen, and I invite you to respond to give you and our speakers an idea of our global audience. So thank you very much, and I will broadcast the results in a few minutes. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our series landing page, where we will also publish information about upcoming episodes, and you can find the link to our landing page on the chat box. You can also ask questions and vote questions submitted by others anytime using the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen. We kindly ask you to keep the questions brief so that our moderators will be able to sort them quickly and pass them to our chair. And if you get disconnected, just use the same link that you have received when you registered to log in again. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School of Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. I will now introduce our chair, Professor Durham, and broadcast the results of the live poll. Professor W. Cole Durham Jr. is the founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. He graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he was note editor of the Harvard Law Review and managing the editor of the Harvard International Law Journal, former chair of the comparative law and of the law and religion sections of American Association of Law Schools. He is the immediate past president of the International Consortium for Law and Religion Studies, or ICLARS, based in Milan, Italy. He is the co-editor of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. He is the co-author of Law and Religion, National, International, and Comparative Perspectives, the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Law and Religion, and co-author of 4-volume treatise, Religious Organizations and the Law. He is currently president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association. So you now see also the results from where people are connecting from, and I give the floor to Professor Durham and our wonderful panelists.
So thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you to the others who are involved. This 7th session of this webinar series is occurring during a week when all of the individual states of the United States have begun the process of reopening. Many are doing so before they fully comply with federal guidelines that call for 2 weeks of declining COVID infections, hospitalization, and deaths, and that contemplate the states are ready with adequate testing and tracing in place so that further risks of the virus can be minimized. The situation is polarized in this country, in the United States, with some demonstrating in favor of reopening, but a majority of the country still having worries that we may be reopening too rapidly. The situation is obviously unfolding in different parts of the world at different speeds. Still, while much attention remains focused on urgent current responses, increasingly attention is beginning to focus on long-term responses. And in this context, this webinar, with its aim to address how the pandemic is impacting the world and the contribution of the business sector, world religions, and international organizations, and organizations like the IMF, these provide a kind of perspective that is going to be extremely important longer term as well as immediately. We're particularly honored today to have 3 major experts who can share important perspectives on responses from the perspective of the interactions of religion and business, the role of religious organizations and networks in the response, and the perspectives of key international financial institutions. We'll first hear from Brian Grimm. Many of us came to know Brian first while he was at the Pew Forum for Religion and Public Life, where he helped pioneer global studies on restrictions of freedom of religion and belief. From there, he moved on to found the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, where he has done extraordinarily creative work, finding ways to enhance the business sector support for religious freedom. He will be followed by Azza Karam. Many of us know Azza from her extraordinary role over the past several years as the coordinator of the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. She currently serves as the Secretary General of one of the largest and most highly respected interfaith organizations in the world, Religions for Peace. And finally, we'll hear from Jeffrey Franks, who has had wide experience serving with the International Monetary Fund and currently serves as the Assistant Director of the European Department of that institution. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Brian.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you, Francesco, and my fellow panelists. It's good to be with everyone around the world. I saw from the poll that it's quite an international gathering today. So I wanted to share about something amazing that's happening in corporations across the United States and really across the world. They, in the past years, have become more faith-friendly. By that, I mean that they are opening their workplaces to having religious expression within them, and a growing movement of employee resource groups or employee affinity groups has grown up in some of the world's largest corporations. In some companies like Texas Instruments and American Airlines, American Express, Intel, this movement is 20 years in the making. They've had faith-oriented employee groups in their companies for decades. In other companies like Salesforce, Walmart, the biggest player really in the world in terms of employment, they've just gotten into the game. Walmart just started their first employee faith resource group last fall. And when you get the largest employer in the world jumping into the game, there's really a movement afoot. Other companies like Salesforce started their employee faith group called Faith Force about 3 years ago. And it's now the fastest growing employee group in the company's history. These groups fit within the corporation's diversity and inclusion initiatives, which most people are familiar that they support minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, gender, sexual orientation issues within the workplace, making people feel more inclusive. But now we're sort of reaching a tipping point with corporations becoming more faith-friendly. So when you think about business, it's important to realize that businesses at their root are people. And I mean that because people work in businesses, people are the creative minds in the business. And when you think of business, you have to expand your thought from not just, say, a large corporation and their multinational corporate office, but it includes, take Apple, for example, everything from their manufacturing to their creative offices to the stores that sell the product, and then the customers that use them. So it shouldn't be too surprising that companies are now seeing the importance of becoming faith-friendly. Now the way that this connects with the current epidemic, pandemic, is that research is showing that one of the huge impacts that's happening among people around the world is depression, increase in substance abuse, other things that are related to not having a job or not being in times of uncertainty. And having these spiritual resources within companies will be a tremendous support, not only when people get back to work, but already right now. For example, every month we've been having Fortune 500 webinars or WebEx calls where a different company takes the lead, sharing what they're doing to help both their employees and their customers deal with this crisis. So we started off with Intel. Last month we had American Express. And then coming up in June, we'll be having American Airlines sharing what their employee groups are doing to help people. And just as one example, the faith groups in one of the large companies held their first ever company-wide meeting for the people faith to share what they see from their resources to help companies. And it was one of the largest gatherings online within that company in the company's history. Two other points I'll make. The second is that as you think about companies, also realize that what they're doing in their products and services is making a huge difference during the time of this pandemic. Just one example, Tyson Foods, which is the largest meat producer, protein producer, food producer in the United States, has kept its factories running. They've had to struggle with some infections and impacting their workforce. But one thing behind all of that in these companies, Tyson employs a workforce of chaplains. They're on paid staff, chaplains to minister to the needs of the employees. So as this pandemic has rolled out and companies that have been essential to keep our food supply in operation, chaplains have been on the front line of keeping those employees and workforces grounded and meeting the needs, both spiritual and physical and medical at this time. And the last that I'll mention, and one that at American Airlines, there's one of their chief flight controllers at their Dallas headquarters is Father Greg McBrayer. And I use that word father. He's an Anglican priest, chief flight controller, and what he would describe himself as a bivocational minister. So he helps American Airlines move all their aircraft and products and people around the world. At the same time, he serves as chaplain and works with their Christian employee business resource group, EBRG, in American Airlines, which has chapters all around the world. One of the things that I think is going to come, just looking forward to the future, is that people, some of the smaller denominations or smaller faith groups that have been employing ministers full-time are being hit by this crisis financially. And the role and possibilities for bivocational ministries such as Father Greg's ministry at American Airlines will grow in the future. Again, as you think of business, realize that at their root, they're people, and people bring with them all the resources that they have from their faiths to help others. They're engaged in making products and providing services that are helping, and including the company that's helping us broadcast this webinar. And finally, the future of work, especially in the faith-based community, may move a bit more towards bivocational ministries in the days and years to come.
Thank you very much, Brian. We'll turn things over now to Azza Karam.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you in different time zones. Thank you very much indeed for the incredible privilege and honor to be with you here today. I'm always extremely grateful for a chance to be with Professor Cole Durham and Brian Grimm and others. You have all set such an important trend in the space of religion and ... fill in the dots. There are some great names in this space, and you are certainly among them, and therefore an honor. I was extremely impressed to hear what Brian had to share, and I will change a little bit what I was intending to share with you, which is basically to show how religious engagement per se, i.e. working with religious actors, whether they're religious institutions, religious NGOs, religious communities, how working with these actors takes place between and amongst governmental, intergovernmental, and other non-governmental actors. And I think having been duly instructed and informed by what Brian has shared, a few interesting pointers to just reflect on with you. I come from a background where the United Nations system in which I worked in for 2 decades I was told in the very beginning, we don't do religion. Literally, we don't do religion. I'm quoting. By the time I left the UN a few months ago, it was clear that the UN very much does religion. And perhaps in ways that are not necessarily coordinated or clear to all of those who work in that incredibly massive corporate structure. The United Nations is a massive corporation, by the way, of many, many, many different entities, about 60, one of which is the World Bank Group. So the United Nations system is a massive global system. Clearly, this system now does religion. And the question, and in ways extremely similar to what Brian was describing is taking place in the business sector. There's more of an awareness of the spiritual identity, the value that it holds for many people. There is more, therefore, of an interest in trying to see how religion sustains communities, but more critically, there has been a shift in awareness from religion as only the problem, which is very widespread, especially amongst those who claim they don't do religion. Usually they don't do religion because religion is a problem and we don't want to focus on the problem. So when the shift happens to, yes, we do religion, it happens also because there's an appreciation that the religious, quote unquote, broadly speaking, has something positive to contribute to this space. So religion is a problem, still very much informs why now religion is actually very helpful and an answer, because religious organizations are the oldest social service providers, therefore the original development. And the original development actors are actually religious organizations, religious institutions, schools, hospitals, clinics, even centers for food service provision have traditionally, actually, long before we've had our governments, have been these religious institutions. So the awareness of the economic power and the social power, social service development power of religious institutions and religious actors has expanded over the last 2 decades within these multilateral spaces. And therefore, with that expansion of understanding of the actual huge relevance spiritually, economically, politically, and now financially of the religious spaces, with this expansion of awareness came an urgency almost in engaging, in partnering, in doing work. That's all very good because it is important for us to mobilize all sectors of society, and the religious sectors are huge and massive infrastructurally, but also deeply symbolically inside the very spirit of every human being. So it's a mobilization, if you will, when we talk about religious engagement, it's a mobilization of way beyond the institutional infrastructure, which is big enough. It's a mobilization of the spirit. And I think this is the point that we often overlook in terms of, because you cannot quantify, and at the same time you can see the trends happen within even the business and private sector, as you've heard from Brian. Now, I don't need, therefore, to speak to how wonderful that is and how critical and important, because clearly there is an awareness that this is all important, because you need to speak to people's hearts and souls, but you also need to get those who are delivering critical services and are the original first responders in almost all humanitarian crises around the world. Religious institutions and religious NGOs are among 4 of the top 10 global humanitarian responders. So the ones who are there already doing humanitarian work, by the way, we're all with COVID, thank you very much, confronted with a global humanitarian crisis, global humanitarian crisis. So guess what? The religious actors are on the front line. And so, yes, critical, important to see that. We need every single hand on deck. That includes all that incredible power and wealth that the religious institutions bring on and the religious NGOs bring on board. Not to be the prophet of doom, although those of you who know me and work with me in other sectors probably will call me that, but perhaps just a bit of a reality check. Let us simply listen to what Brian said, if we were to record and listen to it again. And imagine that we're talking about Muslim organizations, Muslim actors in Muslim countries and Muslim businesses. And let us imagine this incredibly powerful growth of a feeling of affinity with the faith and the religion. And I wonder how we would look upon it then, all of us. Would it be with the same equanimity and gratitude and appreciation? Or would we be a little bit concerned, some of us be a little bit concerned that this religious sensibility and sensitivity is now in Colgate or Palmolive or Intel or what have you? It's a question. It's a question just for you to think about and to reflect and to gauge how it would make us feel, to appreciate that there is this rising religious appreciation that takes place within our public sector, not only the governmental, but also the business. But it isn't happening in the part of the world that we know and the religion that we kind of are comfortable with, but maybe with other religions in other parts of the world. And I think you can see some of the implications of this in countries other than the United States as well. If we think about India, if we think about Iran, if we think about other countries in the world where there are other religions that are not Christianity, and the growing spirituality and acknowledgement of the faith that is taking place in those spaces, in those businesses. And then the question becomes, well, how do you all feel about that? And it's a rhetorical question to consider as we move forward, because I think one of the things that we're somehow overlooking, but that is also happening, is that there's a lot of goodness in this rising spirituality and awareness. There's a lot of need for the spirit amongst every single human being. And nothing as intense as what we're seeing now, because now when faced with a crisis is usually when most of us suddenly appreciate our own vulnerability and humanity. So we look towards the divine, something that is helping us. So this is a moment of that intensity of need of spirit and of divine guidance. And the question becomes that as long as we're familiar with the environment and we like the religion and we're pretty much comfortable with it, that must be very nice. But what happens when it's other religions in other parts of the world, and that affinity and proximity between the political, the money, and the religion become part of that infrastructure, increasingly part of the infrastructure of the normal around us. It's an interesting trend that I just want to end with, also with another sort of question for all of us to ponder on. You know, living in the UN context, from we don't do religion to now everybody does religion because it's very important socially, politically, economically, an interesting development has been, yes, you see, well, Islam is a bit of a problem. I'm being very diplomatic. It's a bit of a problem because, you know, there's Daesh and all that other stuff. And then there's the conflict, Sunnah, Shia, and then there's this rather uncomfortable thing happening in certain countries with Hinduism and Buddhism, conflict is being spurred. So these are religions which are a little bit less. We were somehow less comfortable with. But even if the Islamic context can be very problematic for many of us, guess what? Have you heard of Islamic finance? And oh my goodness, the money that is out there that can be put to such good use, because we are all looking for resources. But so we may have Muslim terrorists, and there is this Islamic terrorism thing, and what do you call it and what do we not call it? But guess what? There is Islamic finance, and that is good. That is really very good. We must figure out how we can work with this Islamic financing. Just an interesting polarization of perspectives. The point is, religious institutions are also some of the wealthiest around the world, and some more than others. So when we turn our attention to looking at the religious as the financial source or center, what is happening with our understanding of the religious? Are we instrumentalizing the religious in that case? Which religions get instrumentalized more than others? Are we systematic in the way that we're looking at all religions? Or do we keep thinking of religion as Christianity in our largely white Western hemisphere, when we look at the same patterns that we see as good in that largely Northern Western hemisphere Christian? Are we necessarily seeing the same patterns as good in the non-Christian Western hemisphere? I can tell you that I think there's a bit of a discrepancy in the way that we do see them. Some of us are more concerned than others. Religion entering into the public space, whether it is through the political or the financial, has good and bad. It's not a one uniform story, and it's not all good and it's not all bad. The issue here is not whether it is entering into the public space. It is with us, it is among us, it is who we are. For some of us, it's been there all the time. It never went away anywhere, right? The question then becomes, how are we as protagonists who are engaging in different way, either academically or politically or financially, how are we seeing the good and the not so good in this space? Are we ready for the polarized opinions, the anomalies in our own perceptions and understanding? Are we ready to accept that our own limitations of acceptance of some religions more than others? Are we ready to accept how some of those prejudices translate into the financial space and the political space as well? Or are we simply assuming that everybody's really going to be very good about this and all religions are equal and all spirituality is the same? We're not. So what are the implications of that in our engagement on religion and business and private sector and politics? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azza. We'll turn now to Jeffrey Franks with the International Monetary Fund.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and be in the distinguished company of Brian Grimm and Dr. Asa Karim. If any of you have ever wondered why they call economics the dismal science, you are about to find out. So I'm going to be a bit discouraging today. I'm warning you in advance, because I'm going to talk about the current economic situation that the world faces. And then I will discuss briefly how that might affect religious organizations at the end, because I think there are some real challenges there. So I have a presentation here that I'll share with you very briefly. First, let me preface my remarks by saying that I'm speaking in an individual capacity. I'm not, my views should not be construed as being official views of the International Monetary Fund. But in terms of the economic analysis that's here, I don't think you'll find anything that's inconsistent with what you would find on IMF.org. Let me just set the stage for where we are in the world economy today. Before we, oops, we're not moving to the next slide. Okay. Before we entered into this current crisis, the world economy was already facing some difficulties. We had experienced a long but relatively weak economic recovery from the global financial crisis of a decade ago. And even before the pandemic, economic growth was slowing. In fact, in 2019, global GDP growth was the lowest that it had been since the global financial crisis. So there were already some warning clouds on the horizon. And then when we hit the coronavirus situation, it really changed everything. And I'll show you in a minute how it has radically changed the IMF's view of what's going to be happening to the world economy. This is a screenshot from the Johns Hopkins University COVID tracker from just yesterday. You can see we're now in a situation of 5 million cases worldwide, 324,000 deaths. In the right-hand lower corner, you see new cases per day. The good news of that chart there is that it's no longer increasing exponentially. The bad news is that it's stabilized at something like 80 to 100,000 new cases a day. So we're in a situation where we're far from seeing the end of this particular problem. Economic activity has been dropping very, very sharply since the crisis hit early this year. And you can see on the left-hand side here what we economists call the Purchasing Managers Index. And that's basically asking purchasing managers in companies, how's their business doing? And how are their orders doing? And how is their production going? And you can see that there's a very, very sharp drop in the beginning of 2020. DM means developed markets, so advanced economies. EMs are emerging markets. And you can see drops in both areas. China had a very sharp drop a little bit earlier, and now they're starting to go into the recovery phase. On the right-hand side, you can see unemployment in advanced economies. And you can see this very, very dramatic increase. And if you compare that back with the global financial crisis, you'll see that in fact, we're in a situation where unemployment is likely to be much higher and have moved much higher, much more quickly than in the global financial crisis, which at the time we were saying was the worst recession since the Great Depression. This is what the IMF had in its World Economic Outlook projections in January of this year. And just, you don't need to look at the individual numbers, but just look at those green numbers projections for 2020 and 2021. World growth was actually going to improve a bit from 2019, which was, as I said, a weak year. And things were going to be looking reasonably good for the world economy. This is what we were projecting last month. The numbers have changed radically. World growth, instead of being positive 3.3%, is going to be negative 3%. And you can see that in certain areas, it's going to be much worse than that, particularly so far in advanced economies. But also emerging markets and developing countries are going to have negative growth. Now, it is true that in 2021, our current projection is that there will be a rebound. But if you add up the 2 years, 2020 and 2021, you still end up in a much weaker space than we were in excuse me, than we were in just a few months ago. Unfortunately, these projections from last month are no longer fully valid. We're actually thinking that things might get worse. What is the recession likely to look like? Well, the green line here on the left-hand side shows what the global financial crisis looked like. The dotted blue line is our current forecast of what we think is going to happen in this crisis. You can see that it's deeper and it's longer lasting. On the right-hand side, you see a chart that basically says what percentage of the countries in the world are going to have negative growth. And you can see that that number is going up to around 90% of the countries in the world will have negative per capita growth this year. So it's not just a deep recession, it's a very broad recession in countries around the world. Our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, just said a couple of days ago to the Financial Times, with the crisis still spreading, the outlook is worse than our already pessimistic projection. Without medical solutions on a global scale, many economies and more adverse development is likely. So what she's saying is basically, and we are doing this right now, I'm already working on revising our forecast for the countries that I work on, and we're revising those forecasts downward. So those numbers that I showed you in the slide a couple of slides ago are actually better than what we're going to be publishing a month from now. We come out with our forecasts every 3 months. And you can see this illustrated on the right-hand side when you see some scenarios that we've already run. What happens if the outbreak lasts longer? What happens if there's a double dip in the outbreak? And you can see that those are going to make scenarios that are worse and longer lasting than what we have forecast up until now. So what are we doing about this? And there's a lot that's being done by organizations all over the world. I'll just focus on my own organization given the absence of time, and I can answer questions about what the World Bank and others are doing in the Q&A if people are interested. But basically, we in the IMF have mobilized our resources in an unprecedented way. We have 102 countries out of 189 in the world that have requested IMF assistance. We've never had so many simultaneous requests in the 75-year history of the IMF. We have expanded the emergency facilities that we already had in existence, increasing the capacity up to $100 billion. This is money that's available with no conditionality. So people often complain about IMF money comes with a lot of conditions. This is actually zero conditionality money that is being made available very, very rapidly to countries. We also have implemented immediate debt servicing relief to the 25 poorest countries who are members of the IMF. So what that means is they don't have to pay the interest and they don't have to pay the principal on any loans that they have to us for the coming period. We've also asked for private sector donors and other organizations to do the same thing. Some have said yes, some are still negotiating that possibility. And we're also making available our regular credit facilities to countries. Many of them are taking an emergency facility now, but that won't be enough. They'll have to come back with us for a regular lending facility in the coming months. There's been discussions you may have seen in the press about creating money. We have our own money in the IMF and we can create more of it and distribute it if it gets approval of the member states. Right now, these are the countries that have received already this emergency assistance from the IMF. So there have been, as of day before yesterday, 57 countries who have received approval. So out of the 102, we've already approved 57. 21 billion US dollars in those 57. And we've also given debt relief to the 25 countries for a total of $229 million. Just yesterday, I was looking after I prepared the presentation, we approved 2 more countries, so it's now up to 59. Jordan and St. Vincent and the Grenadines were approved for emergency assistance yesterday. So we're really trying to pump the money out as quickly as possible to provide resources to compensate countries for the economic and for the healthcare costs that they're facing in this crisis. How is this going to affect religious organizations? I don't think we have any data on this at this stage, but I can offer a few speculative thoughts about how this is likely going to impact. I think first of all, because this is my area as an economist, let's talk about some financial impacts. It's likely that donations are going to fall significantly. With a lower employment and with smaller GDP, households have less disposable income, and that likely means they're going to cut back in many areas, including in their charitable donations. But also, most organizations collect donations in person. And so if they're not meeting in person, they're not going to be able to collect these donations. A recent report from the National Congregation Study indicated that in the US, only 48% of religious organizations were able to accept donations electronically. So less than half in an advanced country like the US are even capable of accepting donations that are not being made in person. So you can imagine what will happen in those organizations that don't have that capability and aren't able to meet. Finally, religious organizations are of the type of organization that we economists call high fixed cost. What does that mean? It means that a lot of the expenses that those organizations have, they have to pay them whether or not they have meetings. So the building costs are going to continue. In most cases, the salary costs of pastors and priests are going to continue to need to be paid. And that means that they can't really cut back very easily on their expenses. They might save money on heating and cooling their buildings or electricity and that sort of thing, but that's a relatively small portion of the expenses of religious organizations. So I think they're in a bind because the donations are going to be going down, but expenses maybe not so much. In countries that have public funds that help support religious organizations, they are not going to be exempt from the problem because tax revenues are plummeting in most countries because of the economic crisis. And if you in your particular country, and this is the case in many European countries, receive a percentage of tax revenues, that percentage is going to be smaller because tax revenues are going to be smaller. Now, on the expenditure side, it's also clear, and Aza mentioned this, that expenses may also rise because of the need for additional social support. Religious organizations in many countries are the first responders when it comes to social support, and higher unemployment and difficulties may increase demand for food banks and welfare services provided by these organizations. So they really may be caught in a double bind, lower income and higher expenses in these difficult times. Now, beyond the financial, and I'll just throw these ideas out for discussion, there are certainly going to be social and cultural impacts, and we don't know for sure what they might be, but I ask myself, will there be lasting effects on church attendance and affiliation? If people are staying home from their religious observances for months at a time, will they go back? Or will there be some change in their religious observance in the future? Maybe not. More broadly, we know from early economic studies that are already underway that the crisis is so far disproportionately affecting poorer people, women, migrants, and the less educated. So these social tensions that were already existing in many societies are likely to get worse in the short run due to the effects of the crisis. And what will be the social and cultural impacts of those on societies and on religions and religious organizations? So to conclude, let me just say, I think we're really in uncharted territory economically. We don't know what's going to happen because we've never had a crisis like this in modern times. But we don't know how long it will last or how deep it is, but we know it will profoundly affect the world economy. And it's going to be for some time to come. Those people who tell you that next year everything will be back to normal, I think they're deceiving themselves. Economically, we're going to have after effects for several years at the very least. And religious organizations may have fewer resources and greater demands on their resources. And that may have some profound social effects, which may affect our societies in ways that we can't even yet predict. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for our panelists. We had a number of questions submitted in advance, and we have had some this morning. We encourage those in the audience to submit questions. But let me just start with one that's come in this morning first, and this could go to Aza. The question is it now time to have a special chamber at the UN, like a Senate or something like that, of religious leaders worldwide? I guess this is a broader institutional question about how do we institutionalize some of this greater appreciation for religion, or is it better to leave the kind of informal channels that you used to be in charge of? I'll direct this to Aza.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for also for the excellent presentation. If I just may quickly take the opportunity to thank Jeffrey for that brilliant presentation. There's been attempts to convince the UN member states, the governments who are members of the UN, who are the UN. The United Nations is a union of governments. It's 193 governments. There have been attempts over the years to try to create a special sector, unit, division, chamber, like the Security Council, have a religious council inside the UN system. The UN is governmental. It's a governmental entity. So to the extent that the governments are comfortable having the religious leaders be their peers, that would be the moment, I guess, when the UN would sort of countenance such an entity where the religious and the political leader can sit head to head and see each other as equally powerful. I don't know whether that might happen. I don't know whether I would want to see that happen. I think there are many fora where the religious leaders preside and have their own space. The Religions for Peace, the organization I work in, is an organization that is the United Nations of Religions. It isn't called the United Nations, but it acts in every way as the institution that represents all the religious institutions of the world, just like the UN represents all the governmental institutions of the world, so to speak. So do we really need to have one inside the other? I don't know. Would it be a very good idea to have a business leaders council inside the UN? To the extent that we think that the leadership that we have today, whether of the political or of the religious or of the financial systems, is doing a very good job. To the extent that we think that, perhaps the argument can be made for the value. But either way, it is the governments who make up their minds about what happens in the UN, because it's their entity. It is an entity of those governments.
So thank you for that. One question that's come in is whether Jeffrey Frank's PowerPoint would be made available, and Francesco at the end of the today will announce how that will be possible. But the bottom line is yes, but you will probably need to get a link in due course. The next question is maybe a question that picks up on the fact that we had both Brigham and Aza talking about increasing appreciation for religion in the business sector, in the UN sector. Are there ways that those two modes of appreciation can get brought together? Are they kind of in parallel universes, but how do they connect? How does the religious sector in business contribute to appreciation and practical consequences in the UN, and vice versa? Maybe Brian, I'll start with you, and then Aza, if you have any response to that, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Cole. One thing, I'll just note how this movement is working within businesses. It's a fully inclusive movement, including religion, all faiths, and none. So I had mentioned we had a kickoff event with Intel, and their faith groups included Baha'i, Muslim, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, and they have an atheist agnostic group that contributed as well. So the way that this movement is working within companies is that there's sort of basic ground rules, that it's not about proselytizing, it's not about spreading your dogma, but it's more about celebrating the uniqueness and the difference that there are. So it's not a movement sort of where everybody comes together to celebrate the least they have in common, but it's more what does my faith bring to the table, whether my faith or belief is religious or not. And in the Muslim world, I think this is also playing out very interestingly. So we had last fall the first ever International Religious Freedom Business Roundtable in Bahrain. And we had business leaders from across the sectors sign a corporate pledge on religious diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So it was people recognizing the value of all faiths in the workplace. So I think in across the world that this is something that is recognized. We've had business leaders from Lebanon signing the pledge, recognizing that if people of all faiths are not brought together, then Lebanon itself won't continue to be able to be successful as a country. The largest Muslim book dealer or book publisher in Indonesia is also part of this movement, recognizing these. So I think as we think about what's happening in business, it's not that business is taking a platform to promote one religion or another, but again, as I mentioned, it's part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, which is helping to bring in everyone's voice and recognize that whatever my beliefs or faith is, that if that's important to me, that's something that is important within my work. So I see some hope in that. I think it's a model not just for what works in the business world, but it's something that can also help transform the discussion that we see in society about faith, where oftentimes it splits people apart. But what I'm seeing is because it's inclusive, and that this is an area that brings people together. And I'm most heartened by seeing whatever the majority faith is in a particular area where we're working, that they're the ones often taking the lead in this movement towards including disparate voices.
So what I hear from that is that there's much going on that's positive, that sort of works within the business setting, it's inclusive and so forth, but I don't hear that necessarily reaching across and interacting with the public sector. I mean, have you seen it differently, Aza, or do you see and should these spheres remain separate, or are there ways that they can be better coordinated? What is your sense?
Forgive me, just for clarification, are you saying should the spheres of business and religion remain separate, or?
No, as the religious sphere within business, does it speak to government? Does it speak to, how does it speak to the UN, say, or how does it, how are these rising realizations of the importance of religion, balanced, of course, as you said, by some of the problems, but still are there sort of channels for influence across from the business sector into the public sector and vice versa?
I think that the channels of influence have actually always been there. I think that we assumed our own sort of, if for lack of a better word, enlightenment in sponsored way of thinking, where we see everything in clear schisms and binaries, and this one doesn't come to this one. I think that kind of very siloed thinking, a product of our old enlightenment thinking, is really what was at issue here. People of faith have always worked in different institutions and in public life. It was only in a small part of the Western hemisphere that this sort of secular segregation from the religious was perceived and in many respects imposed or happened for whatever reason. But the rest of the world has always bled in. Religion has always bled into every single aspect of life: business, economic, finance, politics. It's always been interconnected. And I think what's happening now is that the former sort of very secular oriented minded institutions have woken up to the realization that, oh my goodness, look, there's this amazing capacity of faith and the religious sector. I think that it's really more, it's not so much that something incredibly new is happening, people are discovering religion. It's more that some of us who traditionally saw things in very siloed ways are having to accept the fact that there's always been a bleeding into, that the religious and the faith aspects have always been part of public life and awareness. But there is also what you've heard described very well by Brian, is that there's also more of a movement towards mobilizing this faith potential, the spirit within the workplace, the values that used to be called values before. Today it's called religion very more openly. I think there was a question about that as well.
Yeah.
Yes, there is more of that awareness and attempt to mobilize this particular space. And I think that in principle, I think that's really very nice. And then it's very good that you can accept the multiple identities of every human being in a workplace. As you accept their gender identity, you also accept that there's a religious identity and a component thereof. The concern that I have is not with whether the institutions are respecting the religious. I think that's a good thing in general, but I'm just concerned about how tolerant are religions towards one another in general. How non-instrumental is this perspective of appreciating the religious? Is it instrumentalized in some way, shape, or form? I would venture to suggest that it is. I think the politics instrumentalizes the religious, and the religious instrumentalizes other spheres. Businesses instrumentalize all the time. I think that tendency towards instrumentalization is the issue here, that we need to be cautious of, so that we're not erring on the side of it's all good or it's all bad. But how is it that this attempt to mobilize may in and of itself be instrumentalizing aspects of faith? And my concern is always to try to make sure that we can keep the faith, if you will, unspoiled, because we can't really get to the very heart of every human being. So can we try not to make religion yet another business, yet another factor, yet another variable that we're talking about? How do we make sure that we cannot commercialize the religious?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me shift to Dr. Franks. And this is a question, are the economic relief packages that have been recently implemented to deal with the acute problems that you portrayed, do you have a sense of whether these packages from the international institutions, from the EU, et cetera, are they going to be sufficient to help people weather the crisis, or will they face a worse crisis than that of 2010? I take it your picture is that it is a worse crisis, but are the relief packages going to be adequately designed to sort of mitigate this damage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I should mention that the response that I detailed of the IMF is really a small part of a much larger response. We have estimated that something like $9 trillion in measures have been taken by countries around the world to try to address the impact. And 9 trillion is a huge number, but as a proportion of the total economic problem, it's still, I would say, probably falls short in some areas. Now, some countries have been very aggressive in their response, and the response seems to be working quite well. Countries like Germany or Austria have responded with fiscal packages that are on the order of 10% of their GDP. They have these short work schemes, so people who lose their jobs still keep their income, or they don't even have to lose their jobs. They just go down the number of hours and the government steps in, pays the difference. These are countries that are wealthy and are able to pay for the healthcare surge in healthcare that they need to be able to do. The problem is that the majority of countries around the world don't have the financial resources to respond as aggressively, even if they wanted to. And that's going to be a huge challenge, particularly for poorer countries around the world. I noticed there was a related question about the response in African countries. And the problem, African countries are a bit late in the wave of infections. So infections are just now hitting many African countries in a big way, but they don't have the financial resources of a Federal Reserve or a European Central Bank, or the ability to issue trillions of dollars of bonds to finance unemployment schemes and back to work schemes. So this is going to be a particular challenge for the world. So I would say some countries have adequately responded, but the majority probably not. And some have not responded adequately because they just don't have the resources to do so. And we in the IMF and the World Bank and other organizations will step in and try to bridge that gap, but our resources are also limited as well.
Francesco, I'm looking at the clock and I don't know how much time we have. Can we take one more question?
Of course, yes, you can.
Okay, great. So we have a question. This one is also for Professor Karam. What do you think is the role of religion in the current situation with increasing populism and also authoritarianism in many West countries? But there's this question, and some of the other questions relate to how the COVID crisis is having an impact on opening up opportunities for greater authoritarianism. But how does this play out? Do we come back from it, etc.?
I think this is also a very good question. There have been some really amazing questions posed, by the way. I'm trying very hard to follow them because they're all excellent to all of us. Just to quickly say that to the extent that religions are lived and enacted by human beings, we'll see the good and the not so good enacted at the same time. Yes, there are religious actors, some religious actors who are part of populist movements, and some of the populist actors are using some religious rhetoric to back up, and religious imagination even, to back up their narrative and their claims and their actions, and as part of their own beliefs. So the assumption that religion is all good and can only be all good doesn't take into account human agency. And at the end of the day, human agency determines and interprets the religious and everyday life. So yes, there are some very, very problematic intersections of the religious with the political, of the religious with the populist, of the religious with the economic. And that's the point I'm trying to say all along. It's not to decry any of the initiatives that are being done to integrate the religious, but it is to say at the end of the day, it comes down to people and their interests, and invariably men and their interests in this kind of space. And I think it's very helpful to be aware of that. It's not there is no universal picture of goodness. Religion will be what human beings make of it, and is always and has been. That's also why we see peaks in religious institutional power, and we see deep lows. The truth here is that, and the point that we need to be aware of, is that any policymaker anywhere in the world has to be aware that the religious realities come with man's interpretation thereof. So yes, we need to make sure we can see the positive. And there was a question about what is it that the religious organizations are doing. As first responders, religious institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, etc., religious NGOs, non-governmental humanitarian and development entities, which are religiously inspired, religious actors, individual religious leaders are doing a lot, are doing plenty. There is no proper documentation because it's almost impossible to document what all the religious people in the world are doing. It's impossible. They're big, they're massive. We are tiny. The secular world is a tiny dot in the prism of the realm of religions and faiths. So it's important for us to be conscious of the fact that from food package to online sessions of counseling, to medicines that are being delivered, to hospitals that are being secured for more. In Central Park in New York City, Samaritan's Purse has a major tent that is serving as an additional hospital space. Samaritans is a faith-based organization. New York City, Central Park. It doesn't get more clear than that how deeply involved the religious sector is. In Geneva, Caritas feeds 5,000 people on a daily basis. Caritas is a Catholic organization. This is in Geneva. So the notion that what are the religious actors doing? It's a silly notion because it's a little bit like asking what is every human being doing, but these are actually the main responders. These are the first responders. And the truth is that they're doing plenty. Now the question is, does that mean it's all good? No, because it's still human beings, there's still ideologies, there's still competing interests, there's still instrumentalization from all sides. The religious actors in the political space, just read history, just look at history.
Has it always been a relationship of goodness, or has there been mutual instrumentalization, which has hurt a lot of people? I'm conscious and I need to end this by making it very clear. Religions, faith, spirituality is all good. When it gets instrumentalized and used by anybody, it can be the most harmful. We need to keep our faith distinct from the uses that are made of it in different spaces, and appreciate that the use will have harm, because that's just the way of nature. Thank you.
What a great note to end on. If we could have applause, I'm sure we would get a loud range of applause. I don't know if we have a signal for that, but let me turn things back to Francesco to wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Cole, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Let me share with you a gallery view of all of the people who have been involved, our panelists, our chair, and all of the representatives from the sponsoring institutions. It has been a great panel today, and thank you for joining us from many places. To the question of the PowerPoint of Dr. Franks and any other material that our speakers will want to share afterwards, we will send a follow-up email to all of you probably tomorrow with details on how to get that information. Now, I'm happy to announce. What is it? I'm happy. Here we go. I'm happy to announce our next two webinars. The registration on our landing page is already open for episode 8 of next week on the 28th of May at the same hour, 3 p.m. Central European Time. This webinar will focus on European Special Envoys on freedom of religion or belief. We will be honored to have Ambassador Suhr from Denmark, Mrs. Volosiuk from Poland, as well as as Mrs. De Re, Italian Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Mr. Atzbey, State Secretary for the Aid of Persecuted Christians at the Prime Minister's Office of Hungary. The panel will be chaired by Dr. Jan Figel, who is the former European Commission Special Envoy on freedom of religion for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the EU. Episode 9 on the 4th of June will focus on Asia, and more details will be shared soon on our landing page. Again, let me share with you, all of us, and we look forward to welcoming you next Thursday, and we wish you a wonderful week. Thank you.